As we move into Unit 5, we're going to be talking about the Romantic era. I've actually split this particular era into two sections. Unit 5 is the first half of the Romantic era, and Unit 6 will be the second half of the Romantic era. There are really so many composers doing so many things that it's impossible to be able to do this in one unit and really explore and discover these amazing composers. We also have a lot going on, of course, in the art world and the literature world. So really this time period has just exploded in the world of fine art. Here, this first screen that I have up here is the Age of Revolution. Now, at this particular time, as we come into the 19th century, we've had the American Revolution and we've had the French Revolution, and here we have the rise of the middle class from those two revolutions and the end of the reign of the aristocracy. The other thing that happens during the 19th century is the Industrial Revolution. Now, this is really important for someone like me that plays the French horn, where my instrument actually changed quite a bit, and we're going to be talking about that as well. This painting here by Delacroix is something I always show in my live classes that really captures the spirit of freedom and individuality here. There's a lot that could be said about this painting. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it because we have so many other things to discuss. But as we can see here, Lady Liberty is plunging forward. I do find it very interesting that her top has been exposed. I think that she has so much going on that she maybe doesn't care on an emotional level, but I also think that it's the person bearing his or her soul during this time, especially as we get into the musical realm. We see that emotionalism and individualism becomes extremely important during this time. And I guess what I mean by that too, we see this rebellion as we have on our first bullet point up here. They don't want to be like Haydn and like Mozart anymore. Actually, Beethoven kind of created a bridge between our classical era and our romantic era. So he is someone who by the end of his life was more of this romantic type of composer, where we do have the picturesque, especially if we look at his Ninth Symphony, where we have choral music that's also drawn into the symphony. But the idea of the individual, like Beethoven, who could support himself through the value of his own art, became really important during this time. The patronage system is kind of out of business at this point. Like I said, the Industrial Revolution is very important at this time. Also, the rise of the public concert hall and the rise of the conductor. By the time we get to the end of Beethoven and we move into Schubert and Schumann and some of these romantic composers, we really need to have a conductor because the music becomes very complex. And unlike the classical composers who are looking for a simplification through melody, through form, here the composers are taking those same ideas, but they're expanding them and they're actually making them more complex. So a conductor becomes important. Also, this idea of nationalism, because they're no longer beholden to a particular monarch, the thoughts and feelings of their own countries become really important. Americans can definitely understand nationalism because we feel that America is exceptional and our way of life and our country has its own meanings. If you even think of like the Stars and the Stripes or July the 4th and how patriotic we are. Well, the rise of nationalism really didn't happen until really about this time in the 19th century. Finally, before we actually get into our composers, romantic style traits. This is very important. This melodic, what we call lyricism, these melodies that become longer and more drawn out and more plaintive, they're very beautiful. But they also become more complex. The forms are expanded, pieces are quite a bit longer. A Beethoven symphony might have been 15, 20 minutes long, Berlioz 45 minutes long. As we even get to the end of the Romantic era, sometimes Mahler, an hour and 15 minutes. So they're getting bigger and longer and more complex. We really only have one new form, the symphonic poem. It's actually one long work without any stops and starts in it. We will be talking about solo voice and orchestra and the choral symphony, which Beethoven introduced us to, but the actual new form here would be the symphonic poem. Themes of dreams and passions, you're going to see this when we go into the Berlioz Symphony Fantastique, life and death, destiny, God and nature, good versus evil. All of these are large themes, and you'll see that romantic really means larger and bigger throughout the entire era. And finally, the role of the musician in society. Musicians supporting by the new middle class, what that really means is they are able to sell concert tickets. They become stars. Not only these different solo performers that we're going to be talking about, but the composers themselves. Women are more into the forefront, mostly as performers. We still see they start to do a little composition, but it's not anything like what the men are doing at the time. And finally, this distinction between light music and art music is kind of something more for enjoyment, like we would consider popular music today. And art music would be something more serious, where we're going to really sit down and analyze and think about the music. So there does become this distinction, and it becomes much clearer in the 20th century with the rise of pop music, rock and roll, and so forth. Our first composer is Franz Schubert. Here's a picture of him. He actually only lived to be 31 years old. I actually consider him to be a prodigy, very much like Mozart was, but he certainly is not celebrated as Mozart. But the thing that Franz Schubert was really, really good at, well, he was really good at a lot of things, but he's most well recognized for his songs, and that's actually what your inquisitive is on for this unit, is the song The Elf King. And we're going to be going over that in a second here, but basically he was in the Vienna Boys Choir when he was young, went on to have several patronages because he actually lived at the same time as Beethoven. He died in 1829. Beethoven, I think, died in 1827. Don't quote me on that. Somewhere around there. So they lived at the same time, but Beethoven was born earlier than Schubert was. So what's interesting about Schubert is that he really writes in two different styles. We have his symphony and his chamber music that's very classical in nature, but the songs are very romantic in nature. In your external links, I have some great symphony music, actually a symphony and a string quartet of Franz Schubert's that are quite nice. I actually prefer his instrumental music to his vocal music, but his vocal music serves a very important purpose for us because we're going to talk about the program. This song, The Elf King, actually talks about a legend, and it talks about a story, which is quite important because that's actually what our theme is going to be through this entire unit, is the rise of the program. Program meaning the storyline. Here in this particular poem, you can see there's a father and son, and the son is sick. The Elf King appears to the son, and then the son then dies. In this particular piece of music, this is something we call through composed. There's two different forms, and let me pull that up for you. We have a strophic form, which has the same melody that's repeated with every stanza. This is like the songs that you hear on the radio today. You'll have a verse and a refrain and a verse and a refrain, and the same music is there with different words or different stanzas. Through compose means that you go from the beginning to the end without a repetition of sections. There may be a little bit of repetition, but basically it is completely through composed, where you have just different musical ideas throughout the entire thing. Something I want to show you on your listening guide here, we have two different modes. We have a major mode and a minor mode. We're usually seeing the minor mode. The Elf King is actually major. The son and the father are actually minor, and this is to show that the little boy is scared, that the father is scared. So the idea of dissonance of a darker sound, a darker tone, is actually meant to show the feelings of the characters. If we remember back to the Renaissance and the Middle Ages, we had some of these songs that had the word painting. This is exactly the same idea. The other thing you're going to see, and I'm going to have us listen to the beginning of this, we have these triplets. We have these three, this repeating pattern that is showing the horse. Actually, the horse is galloping, and so this is really meant to show the fast pace of the horse. So if we listen to the beginning of this, we can actually hear how the horse is galloping along, and the narrator begins to tell the story of this fantastical event. There we heard the narrator, and the narrator speaking in German. He's starting to tell the story. If we go over to the Elf King here and listen to the son's cry, we can hear a little bit more of this word painting of this storyline that's being portrayed in the music. So we heard the Elf King say, "Come play with me. It's going to be really fun." And that's actually in a major mode. It's happy. Then the son comes in and starts saying, you know, crazily, "Oh no, help me, Father, don't you hear?" So it's quite interesting how Schubert uses the piano and uses the different modes to be able to portray the storyline. We're going to move on from this because I want to talk about Robert Schumann, who lived about the same time as Schubert, and talk a little bit about his music. So Robert Schumann, very interesting man. He actually only lived to be 46 years old. So another star who died early. He wanted to be a pianist and did actually have moderate success at that until he injured his hand. Now his piano teacher was a man named Frederick Weick. And what becomes very interesting about him is that Robert completely fell head over heels with his daughter Clara. Frederick did not like this, and there was a 7-year battle to keep Robert from marrying Clara because he said Robert wasn't serious enough. Clara was an incredible musician. She performed all over Europe, and everything that she ever did was from memory. And so she was an exceptional musician herself. They did end up getting married, and that was some of the most prolific times of Robert's life, but ended up that Robert became crazy. He ended up with a mental disability and tried to commit suicide and ended up actually in an asylum where he died there. And it was Clara that took care of him along with their 7 children and also performed all over Europe. So she was quite an interesting woman and had a number of compositions in her own right. The book talks more about, there's Robert, talks more about Fanny Mendelssohn, who we're going to get to. But Clara Schumann wrote quite a bit of music that she performed in her home. And then later, I think she did perform some on her performing circuits, but she also heralded a lot of Robert's work as well. Rather than talk about his music right this moment, I'm going to cut this video short and we'll start with his music in the next video.